All right, I want to welcome a man who needs no introduction except to say that he is a legend. Marc Faber, editor and publisher of the Gloom, Boom, and Doom Report. Welcome, Marc.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your program.
I really wanted to have you back on because, every day it seems like the world just gets crazier and crazier. And what I'm thinking this is kind of for America is similar to the British Empire after World War II. COVID almost seems like our World War II, right? That's when they just their currency got crushed. They couldn't afford anything, right? They were just kind of decimated during World War II. COVID is, causing the government deficits to balloon out of control. I don't know how much longer they can continue to print their way out of it. But I do think it's kind of like the big, great battle that America is fighting, and it could lead to a decline similar to the British Empire saw after World War II. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't think that COVID is anything similar to a world war, because world wars, they usually don't last very long. After 2-3 years, people get tired of it, and then they go home. They make peace somehow, somewhere. COVID can last a long time because the casualties are not that high, and they can keep the thing going for a long time. So the government can keep on controlling people and controlling them more and more. I mean, I would say today in most countries in the world, there is less freedom than there was in the Soviet Union after the revolution of 1918. There's less freedom than in Germany under Hitler. Wow. I mean, that you can go in America, that tells the whole world how great their democracies and how much freedom they have and how great the justice system is. And you go to a shop owner and you tell him to close down his shop. How do you think that rhymes? I mean, it's a complete farce. I've never seen nor read in my life, and I've read history quite thoroughly for the 5,000 years of recorded history. I've never seen anywhere or read anywhere a system where they close down the businesses of small people. Never happened. I've seen systems where they took over companies of big people, big corporations. They expropriated them. But the baker, he was able to keep his bakery. The system has never been as corrupt as under democracies. There has never been as little justice. How many government officials have gone to jail in the last 20 years in the US?
Very little.
How many? Hardly any.
Right.
Hardly any. How many people have gone on to jail from Wall Street? Hardly any. And the few people that go to jail, like Jeffrey Epstein, they kill them right away because they don't want them to testify.
Exactly. So that's my
question. I mean, someone has to bring this up. You always just sit there and say nothing. But the reality is that we are living in a system that is very unhealthy.
Yeah, and this is what I wanted to get out, right? That's why I wanted to have you back on, because I wanted to hear the raw truth and where you think this is all headed, because that is the $1 million question, right? So we are where we are now. What does it look like?
It's not headed into a paradisic situation or condition. I think if I look at the last, say, 50, 60 years, say we go back to the Depression years. We had a boom time in the 20s, okay? Then we have depression in the 30s, where unemployment in America went to around 30%. Similar figures were achieved in Europe. If you look at movies of critical movie makers, directors and producers of the 1930s and so forth, You see the conditions of labor, say, in Italy in the 1930s, or even after the war, after the Second World War. There was a period when people couldn't find a job, period. They were living in extreme poverty. Then we come to the 50s, 60s, and there's an economic boom in America and in Europe because we have the post-war recovery, strong economic expansion, and everybody does better. The 70s was again more difficult because the 70s was a period where, although wages went up, inflation was also going up strongly. And so in real terms, people didn't earn that much. Then in the 80s, things were still okay. But in the last 20, 30 years, I'd say young people, they earn less than the parents and they have less money than the parents in real terms. This is the first generation among the young people, Generation Z, and the most recent generation, whatever you call them, the vote, that earns less and has less than the parents in the age of capitalism that is 200 years old. This is a new, unique situation. And I think that it will get much worse, personally.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, right? Because right now we're in this big experiment of money printing, right? Just printing dollars as, as much as we need to prop up the economy. And I mean, you've studied history all around the world. Japan has already tried this, right? So they did it. There was a huge Japanese bubble in the 80s and 90s, and then there was an epic deflation. They had a lost decade or two in the stock market because of that. Is that similar to where you think we're going, where the government reaches a peak in its ability to stimulate, and then there's a few lost decades after that of just like deflation, and there's not much that can be done about it?
Well, what has to be said about Japan is there was a deflation in asset prices. The stock market went down and property prices went down and so forth. But the cost of living of people and their earnings from the salaries didn't go down. And if you go to Tokyo today, if you take a taxi from the airport to the city, it is more expensive than taking a taxi in America from Kennedy to Manhattan. You understand? This I always tell people when they talk about inflation. We have to be very precise in the analysis of what kind of prices we're discussing. And you may say, well, we had a lost decade in Japan, but the Japanese, in a comparison to other Asians, they live a high standard of living. But if you go to Japan as an American family, you go with your 2 children and your wife, you will not live in a house the size that you have in America. That is out of the question. Nor will you have an apartment of the size that your Manhattan apartment will be for the same price. You understand? It's a different lifestyle. Japanese have a different lifestyle than we Westerners have. Now, some have adopted Western standards of living, but this is a very small number of people. The majority lives in very small quarters. They don't have a car. They have very good public transportation. Everybody goes by subway or train and so forth. But but the Japanese, if you go to resorts, luxury resorts in Asia, Four Seasons luxury resorts in Asia, lots of Japanese, because they have a lot of money. So they never had a depression like the US in the 1930s. It didn't happen. But if you ask me about the outlook, and what people should do, the thing is, if you had asked any forecaster, economist, strategist, whatnot, 2 years ago, in the summer of 2019, what is the outlook? They were all bullish and so forth. And nobody predicted COVID. It came unexpectedly. And now you can say, well, where did it come from? Well, first, the government said it comes from a meat market. And the people that said no, it comes from a lab and it was produced with money from the US. They were called conspiracy theorists. And they were banned from YouTube and banned from TV stations and from programming and. And nowadays, only your dead great-grandparents know that it came from a fish or meat market in China. Everybody knows that it's a man-made kind of virus type of sickness that mutates. It's not even a virus, it's a mutating organism. But it's man-made and it comes from a lab. Now we can ask, well, who spread it? Was it deliberate or was it an accident? That everybody can ask himself. But all I'm saying, when we look at the reaction of governments, there's only one country that hardly did any lockdowns, and that is Sweden. And all the others, they used the COVID as an excuse to shut down people's lives, period. Now, if you're very well to do and you have your private plane and so forth, it doesn't affect you. If you live like I do in the north of Thailand and you have a large piece of land, and on one piece of land you have your office, on the other your house, it doesn't affect you much. And at my age, if I don't travel for 2 years, it's not the end of the world. You understand? I can live with that. But if I were in my 40s and developing my business, it would be a rather unpleasant thing to happen. And you can defend your governments which way you want. All I can say is, without any government intervention, in my opinion, the whole world by now would have had COVID. The whole world would have now immunity. And with the vaccines, what they create is mutations of the organism. They will keep on mutating and become more and more difficult. Okay? I'm an economist, I'm not a scientist. I'm just saying, in my opinion, governments have abused COVID to take measures that essentially take freedom away from people. Without question, without question. And it's interesting that people have so far hardly rebelled. They sit there and they say, okay, well.
Well, I think they're enjoying watching the stock market go up.
Maybe they do that. Maybe they enjoy other things going up. Maybe they watch TV and Netflix and so forth. Who knows? But it can't be very good for the economy. That I can tell you.
Absolutely. So that's kind of my question, the big question. What is the end game of all this, right? So if the freedom gets taken away, if the stock market's controlled, I mean, where does this all lead in, let's say, 5, 10 years? What does society look like?
Well, I think that the intelligent answer to this question is that we don't know. Because you don't know what kind of government will come. We could have a very ruthless government, totalitarian, because it's COVID. They can take emergency measures one after the other. They can go to your street and say, from now on, your street is locked down, period. Nobody gets into your street and nobody gets out. And what do you want to do about it? So that is something that people should ask themselves. To what extent do you accept all this BS?
Right. So, well, people are willing to give up freedom for safety, right? But the question is, I guess, being more farsighted, you just don't know how those freedoms can be taken away by maybe a less good
Yes, but I just want to say this: give up freedom for safety. They told passengers after 9/11, yeah, we'll take your nail clipper away at the airport because we want to protect you and everybody else on this airplane. What kind of BS is this? What can you do with a nail clipper? At the same time, in the aircraft, they serve you Coca-Cola in a can. If I break a can in two, I have two deadly weapons, much more deadly than 200 small knives or 200 nail clippers. The government will always use anything as an excuse to take your freedom away. And safety. Well, what is the safety for you to be locked down in a street? You can't go in and you can't go out. What happens if you're sick? If you have an appendix and you can't go out? You call a number and nobody answers.
Right.
So I want to tell you something. Don't believe all this thing about safety. It's not about safety, it's about control.
Yeah.
And I'm surprised. If I were in my younger years, say 40 years, I would start a revolution. But at my age, I say to myself, if I start a revolution, A, for who? For the woke society? I mean, I've been watching the Olympics on the side. They really no longer interest me because it's become kind of a social nonsense. The athletes are not interested in their performance, they're interested in their show. Now, I'm not watching the Olympics or sports for the show business. I'm interested in sports as a contest, as a competition.
Absolutely. Right. Everything's politicized and there's always a
So
social.
why should I start a revolution for someone like this? What's her name? This Biles, the gymnastic, that she can play her show. I mean, for what? For me? So I rather stay. I just stay home.
Yeah.
This is something I would consider. I'm not saying you should take the vaccine or not take the vaccine. I'm not an expert, and we don't know. Maybe some people will take the vaccine and it won't be successful, and others will take the vaccine, it's very successful. So that I cannot judge, but I can judge that the COVID has, like 9/11, has been used to reduce the freedom of people. And you will need one day a passport to use a green shirt. I will need one day a passport to use a white shirt. And then we need a passport to go out of your house, one passport to have a mobile phone, and it will be endless.
Well, did you know they're doing that in New York already? You can't go to certain places without a vaccine, without proof of vaccination.
Yeah, I can believe that.
Yeah.
But I can have a choice not to go to New York.
Right.
And as I vote, as long as Mr. Blasio is the mayor there, I will never go to New York. That for sure. And as long as Mr. Cuomo is the governor, I will never go to New York, the state, either. Why would anyone go to a country that is run by one incompetent and the other completely dishonest person? Well, all politicians are dishonest, so we don't have many choices to go anywhere.
Right. But there is a big disparity and polarization in America, right? So you have the right, you have the left, and it just seems like the division has never been higher between the groups. So do you think it'll lead to an eventual conflict? Because
Well, we had a civil war in America, so I suspect that the conflict at the time was quite high.
you're right.
But I think I don't think we'll have a civil war, but we could have kind of a secession of some states. That some states say, well, we disagree. We're not interested in these policies.
So just a lot of conflict, a lot of crazy times. That's why I'm happy to have you on again. So, but thinking economically, right? So these bubbles, right, that have
Yes,
been created off cheap money. I mean, how do
exactly.
they end, right? Because I don't think that you think the stock market's going to go up forever, right?
Well, I can say that money printing in all cases in history has never led to a favorable outcome. That you can forget about. The second question is then, well, how bad is it, and how long can the party last before it gets bad? Because, as you know, say in 1999, between October 99 and March 2000, the Nasdaq doubled in 6 months. So you understand, as an investor, there is a big opportunity to make a lot of money in the final stages of the bubble.
Absolutely. And I think that is possible. Because again, if you look at the Japanese chart, their bubble was way bigger than even our Nasdaq. So I think there's still some more room to run for the
Yeah,
Nasdaq.
yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. The Nasdaq today uh, has gone up trend line, whereas the Nasdaq 98 to 2000 went up exponentially. So we haven't gone up that much. We've gone up regularly, but not that much percentage wise. We can go on for a while. I would not bet on it. You understand? But my situation is different. I'm 75. I don't need to become rich. I just don't want to lose it all. So I can afford to be very careful. If I were a young guy, I would say, yeah, I borrow heavily money. I make a big bet. And if I go bust, so I'll go bust and I don't repay the money. I'll get someone like Pelosi and so forth to pay off my debts.
Absolutely. Right. So, well, the other interesting thing parallel to 2000 is back then it was the internet. Now it's blockchain technology, right? Which is a revolutionary technology, blockchain.
Yes.
So there could be a bubble built around that. That could be the last excuse for that exponential rise.
Well, we had one theme after another. We had GameStop and then AMC and Cost, and then we had SPACs and we had ARK investments and we had Bitcoins and all the other cyber cryptocurrencies. So there has already been a lot of speculation, but the meme stocks were breaking down, and suddenly one stock went ballistic, Robinhood. You understand, when so many people can be influenced by influencers and Reddit and Facebook and so forth, they can all just pile into one stock. It goes ballistic for a while, it tumbles also.
Right.
And then they can find another stock.
Right. Exactly. So here's the question, right? So even thinking back to the 2000s, gold and silver were so depressed in 2000, right? Like there was a
Correct.
tech bubble, gold and silver completely and
Correct.
utterly depressed. Do you think there could be a correction similar to after that when gold 10x'd?
Gold is now also relatively inexpensive compared to financial assets,
Right.
but nowhere near to the level it was in 99 2000. That we have to understand. And I think I never sell any gold, so I'm saying this in the context of someone who always owns gold and has about 25% of his assets in gold. I'm saying that although I have assets in gold and I never sell, I think the gold and silver price are not acting well. They may start to act well tomorrow or in 3 months or whenever. But I'm just saying, for the last few months, gold and silver have not acted well, period.
And that's why I'm kind of drawing a comparison to 2000 when they acted terribly, but followed by a massive move, right?
Yes, but as I said, gold shares today, say 20 months ago, 18 months ago, you could have bought a lot of the shares that are today at, say, 100. You could have bought them for 20. A lot of them have already gone up a lot. They've corrected now 30, 40% already. A lot of them are already down 30, 40% in just a brief period of time, 2 months. And I think some may be looking to form a bottom, but I think there's still a risk on the downside. And I'm saying this as someone who likes gold and silver. I'm not saying this as someone who is always bearish about gold and silver, not at all. It may change, within a week or two. They could be acting well again, but for the time being, they're not acting well. And I think there are two reasons. There's a reason that there is a bout of inflation at the present time. The question is, how long will it last? Because as you've seen, the price of lumber has gone up from, say, 300 per lumber foot to 1,600. Now we're back to 560. So we're down more than 50% from the peak. So we have a lot of volatility, and this inflation may be temporary. I think it will be not temporary, but the rate, recently, I'd say, if you look at your cost of living over the last 12 months, I suggest that it's gone up by at least 10%, at least, So it will not continue to go at the present time at 10% per annum. I don't think so. But eventually it could go much higher because the governments, they think they're very smart, and they will point out these Fed geniuses that are essentially a bunch of crooks. They will point out that, well, we printed a lot of money, but look, inflation is low. Because who controls the statistical department? Not you and me and your viewers. The statistical department is controlled by the Ministry of Truth, in other words, the government. And they can fiddle around with statistics as they like. They could show deflation. They could say, well, you have now Zoom. It's a huge quality improvement in your life. So we deduct 10% of the cost because you have now Zoom free of charge. And so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is true. Technology is deflationary, right?
To some extent, yes. But all I want to tell you that from the time I started to buy computers, which is now approximately 30 years, I have never bought a computer at a lower price than the previous one. Now, you will say, well, your computer today is, of course, a much better computer than what you bought 30 years ago. To this, I respond, yes, I agree with you, but to live today and do my job today, I need a computer that is much better than 30 years ago. 40 years ago, I didn't need a computer. And my grandfather, he didn't need a telephone. You understand? So they will always tell you, yeah, things become cheaper. But actually, no, they don't become really cheaper. There are certain things that can become cheaper, but with the cheaper devices, the quality is such that you may not be able to do the same things relative to the world as you were able to do 20 years ago. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And your children When they want the mobile phone, I assure you, they don't want the cheapest mobile phone. They will say they want an iPhone or whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. You're totally correct on that. So I guess that's kind of what weighing in on the is inflation transitory debate. Does it just kind of like go up, plateau, go up, plateau, go up, plateau in terms of the cost of living?
Maybe could be.
Yeah.
But the trend, and I can say this because I have a vantage point that goes back more than 70 years. So when I was 5 years old, I know what the cost of a bread was. And I know what the cost of a bread is today. Say a bun of bread. Or I know what the movie ticket was then and what it is now, and so forth and so on. And I also know what the cost of a house was then and what it is now, because we have in our family some houses that we had for a very long time. And I also know what the cost of taxes is. And I know about the quality decrease of government officials. And I know about the corruption increase of government officials. So I'd like to build this into a consumer price index, and then inflation will be much higher than what they suggest.
Do you think the rich will keep getting richer and the poor will keep getting poorer in terms of the asset owners? Well, that's as long as the bubble keeps inflating, right? If the bubble
Correct.
keeps inflating,
One day this comes to an end. Then it's like when the Bolsheviks came in, or when the Soviet Union expanded after World War II in Eastern Europe. People who had assets, you say you were an aristocrat and you owned a castle. Your land ownership was gone. It's not there anymore. It doesn't belong to you anymore. You were lucky if you could be the doorman at that time as the previous owner in your factory. Can happen. Can happen. A lot of wealthy people have lost everything they had after World War One, after World War Two. It's going to happen again.
Okay, so then just, some key takeaways for investors. There's this huge bubble going on. It could still continue to go on, but however, there could be a correction because these things don't last forever, right? And when it does correct, things like gold and silver, which have been severely underperforming, right, the broader market, should probably do a reversal.
I think that's an issue that we need to consider. I think a lot of speculative money that maybe in previous years would have gone into gold and silver, went into cryptos, went into meme stocks, went into all kinds of SPAC companies and so forth, private equity, and then my advice in general is, I think that the value of paper money will continue to lose. You understand? Also, we have an unusual situation when you think about this. We have, both in Europe, in the US, the most negative real interest rate since the 70s. The most negative. In other words, say inflation, if we don't need to take an extreme and say it's 10% per annum. It's closer to 10% per annum now than it is to 1%. That's for sure. But let's be government friendly, and let us be dumb and believe what the government is publishing. So let's say inflation is around 4%. But if interest rates are zero, your deposit rates are around zero. In Europe, we have negative interest rates. Then your real interest rate, inflation adjusted, is minus 4%.
Right.
This is a hugely negative real interest rate. Very negative. And usually that environment is good for assets, it's good for gold, it's good for real estate, it's good for farmland, and so forth. So I am basically arguing, yes, this situation will not go on forever. It can go on for another few years, possible. I wouldn't necessarily bet on it. I would say, gold has performed for someone like myself, who is relatively positive about gold in the long run. The performance of gold has been very disappointing given the quantity of money that has been printed everywhere in the world, everywhere. And I'd say emerging markets have also performed poorly. But
Exactly.
like gold, they may continue to underperform for a while. But I can see, if you ask me here in Asia, I can see, say, 10 to 20% of companies in Asia are undervalued at the present time.
Yeah, well, the stock market in China has just been crashing recently, right? And that's because people are afraid of the authoritarian government, right? The regulation and things like that, which is, it's hard to say I blame them if you have a government that is unpredictable and could just anytime just shut down industry.
You think the government is predictable in the US?
No, not at all. Not
We're not talking about one unpredictable government and another unpredictable government.
all over
We're
the
not
world.
talking. I can say one thing: you put all the IQ of the government in China, you add them together, and you put all the IQs and you add them together in the US. In China, it's much higher. That there's no question about. Also in Russia, although they drink 3 times more, but even if they drink 3 times more, it's much higher than in the US.
I spoke to someone yesterday who believes that in the background of China, what's happening is they kind of slowed their stimulus down, which is causing, a depression in their financial assets. But when they pick up their stimulus, this could be an incredible buying opportunity potentially in Asian stocks. And you were saying they're undervalued. So,
Yes, I think a lot of stocks, also Indonesia, Thailand. I think I see good value also in Hong Kong and Singapore. For the first time in, say, 20 years or so, well, okay, 2009, stocks were very depressed, and they became again depressed last March. They rallied again, but a lot of stocks have given back a lot of these gains. I think I'm quite happy to hold Asian stocks. I think they will go down first. I think European stocks are reasonably priced, not terribly expensive compared to zero interest rates, especially. But as I said, I'm essentially of the view that you should own some gold and silver. I also own platinum. I like platinum. I think in the long run it will be very attractive. And I would own some real estate in the countryside. You can buy in Italy, Spain, Portugal, in the countryside, a house for nothing.
and that's because you think these assets, precious metals, small parcels of real estate should do well after this bubble corrects, after the financial asset wider bubble eventually corrects, or do you just think, they'll just appreciate over time?
I think when the serious decline in financial asset happens, people will rethink, well, financial assets, there may be a problem, and so forth. And then they will have a larger exposure to precious metals.
Yes.
At the moment, there is no interest in precious metals because they move down. You understand? If you look at the inflows into ETFs, there's big inflows into tech ETFs, into ARC type of stocks, into SPACs and so forth, but not into gold and silver ETFs.
This discussion is for informational purposes only. Nothing in this discussion should be taken as investment advice. Guests are not compensated for their appearance. Do not base any investment decisions on the information presented.